Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Miriam. It's an honour to be here. In 1989, I bought a book called Traditional Alternatives, written by Jonathan Sacks. And in that book, he spoke about Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, which means that there was another person other than me in the United Kingdom who knew who Rabbi Chaim Hershenson was. So this was the first thing that piqued my interest. In 1990, a year later, the same Jonathan Sacks gave a lecture series on Radio 4 called the Reef Lectures, a series of lectures by academics that have been running for decades, called Persistence of Faith. And there he spoke about people like Gadamer and Durkheim, people I had studied in my political science classes at Leeds University. So now there was somebody who knew both Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, Emil Durkheim, and Gadamer. A year after that, Rabbi Sacks was interviewed by the Thinking Persons DJ on Radio 1. Now, Radio 1, for you Israelis, is kind of Galgalatz, sort of. And this Thinking Persons DJ was called Nicky Campbell, and the show was called Into the Night. And it was on 8 o'clock in the evening, and the audience would have been in their teens and 20s. And it was a very eclectic show. So he would interview Frank Zappa and the Bee Gees, John Major and Tony Blair, the Right Reverend Ian Paisley and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Sir Ian McKellen, and Jonathan Sacks. Now, there was somebody who knew not only Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, not only Emil Durkheim, but also Nicky Campbell. Now, this was unique. And I start with this story because, in a sense, that's the point. Rabbi Sacks is unique because he was the only rabbi who could reach the parts that no other rabbi could reach. He was genuinely able to speak to a wider body of people in a meaningful sense, Jewish and not Jewish, religious and secular, academic and non-academic, than anyone else I can think of, full stop. So how did he do it? That's what I want to explore today. But before I go into the issue of rhetoric and communication of a rabbi as a public intellectual, I just want to give you all a sense of just how far his influence reached. He spoke at the Millennium Peace Summit at the UN, and he spoke about peace, which is unusual for what's a Humphrey term, the internationally recognized forum for the expression of hatred. He spoke at Davos, the World Economic Forum. He spoke in the European Parliament, many times in the House of Lords, at the US National Prayer Breakfast, founded by evangelical Christians. He spoke somewhere where I've spoken, in my world, the Council on Foreign Relations in America. He spoke at the Aspen Institute. He spoke at Google, at Facebook. He spoke on the radio, as I've mentioned, on Persistence of Faith, or series more recently on morality. His books were serialized in the Times. And then there's the quantity of people he reached. He sold over 50,000 books in Steinmatzky's. The next rabbi along hasn't sold 10,000. His Parshat HaShavua is distributed to 250,000 people every week. 250,000 people have watched his dialogue with Richard Dawkins on YouTube. He has another 20 videos that have been watched by more than 100,000 people each. 1 million people visit the Rabbi Sacks Legacy website every year. More than 2 million people have watched Rabbi Sacks' TED lecture on TED. More than many more hundreds of thousands have watched it on other platforms. So it's about 500,000 on YouTube to add on to that. then the variety of people he has reached. His books and his Parsha Shavua have been translated into the following languages: Hebrew, Spanish, French, German, Russian, Persian, Italian, Dutch, Czech, Portuguese, Turkish, Korean, Chinese. They're being translated into Arabic and, most difficultly, into American English. Then there are the heads of state of whom he has had a major influence. King Charles III called him a light unto this nation. President Rivlin called him a light not just for the Jewish people, but for all people. Tony Blair said, Rabbi Sacks ended up, in part, giving me a sense of my own religious tradition, of why it was important to have faith, and how faith is central to human progress. Yair Lapid called him my rabbi, and they had a long debate about hope and optimism. He has received 21 honorary doctorates. He has had conversations with some of the leading public intellectuals of our day: Jonathan Haidt, Michael Walzer, Robert Putnam, Richard Dawkins. He's lectured Harvard and Yale, Oxford and Cambridge, but he took great pleasure in telling me in 1993 that a Catholic day school in the UK invited him to speak about ethics, and he was stunned that a Catholic school would invite a rabbi. Now, 30 years later, knowing Rabbi Sacks, this doesn't seem strange to us, but it was important to him, and he was very moved and thought it was significant. And then there are the other religious leaders who he has dialogued with, the Dalai Lama and the Pope. Now, interestingly, I can't point to that many rabbis, but I can point to one very impressive rabbi whom he had a close relationship with, whom Time magazine referred to as the sort of mind that only crops up every 1,000 years, and that's Adin Steinsaltz. I can also tell you that my wife, when she gives Divrei Torah, pretty much uses Rabbi Sacks all the time, and she tends to work with a lot of people who would not define themselves as observant Jews. But nonetheless, after hearing Rabbi Sacks' Divrei Torah, even a former Meretz MK was deeply moved and deeply inspired. That is the extent of Rabbi Sacks' reach. Okay, so now let's move to rabbis in public, rabbis as intellectuals, and rabbis as public intellectuals. So there are a number of different models that we can look at. There's the rabbi who uses their broad intellectual background as a platform to engage with the public, but they do not respect their own intellectual background. It is merely bells and whistles, flashing lights, marketing points. It's a Haredi rabbi who has left the modern world, who is using his skill and his former learning in a purely tactical way. That is one type of rabbi who is a public intellectual. There is another type of rabbi who is a public intellectual who uses their title as rabbi to be a public intellectual, but what they say as a public intellectual has very little to do with being a rabbi. Now, I have names for both these people, so anyone who's interested can see me afterwards. Now, when we think of really great rabbis who were also philosophers or intellectuals, as my learned cousin, Professor Daniel Rynhold, has stated, most of these philosophers were bringing outside thought into the Jewish world. And they were saying, this thought is compatible with Judaism, or Judaism is compatible with this thought. So if it was Philo, if it was Josephus, if it was Moses Mendelssohn, if it was the greatest of them all, Maimonides, they were trying to show that something was compatible. That was their main aim. They were not saying something originally Jewish to the broader world. And then there was the final type of rabbi who is a public intellectual, whose public intellectual engagement is deeply rooted in the fact that they are a rabbi. And I'm afraid it's a very small club. The only person other than Rabbi Sachs that I could come up with is Avraham Joshua Heschel. Now, Heschel definitely tried to speak Jewish, as he would put it, as opposed to Western. And there is definitely a connection between his book, The Prophets, and the man who stood in the front row with Martin Luther King at Selma. But he is a difficult man to understand. His writings are not easy, and his focus in his writing is more internal, I would say, and Hasidic, though I'm not an expert in his style, and doesn't relate in a clear, coherent manner to his behavior as a public figure. So we're down to one. And that one is, of course, Rabbi, Professor, Lord Jonathan Sachs. He is, even though he's no longer with us, still one of the leading public intellectuals in the world. There have been many great rabbinical thinkers, but what is exceptional about Rabbi Sachs is that he developed a body of thought deeply grounded in the Jewish religious tradition that speaks to the most important contemporary issues for Jews and non-Jews alike. For many Jews, but also for many people of other religions or no religions, he was looked to as the foremost moral thinker of our age. What's impressive and most significant is that he is at once outward-facing, dealing with the most pressing issues for modern society, and equally, any religious Jew would recognize his message as unmistakably part of the Jewish religious tradition. That is exceptional. So, some people might say, yes, but is it really part of a religious Jewish tradition? Because Rabbi Sachs doesn't talk a lot in the language of biblical commentary when he's writing about society at large. He doesn't use the internal coding words. But the most important thing that he does is that the unity of God is absolutely central to his whole theology, his whole approach to social and political issues. For Rabbi Sachs, only God is perfect, all-knowing, and omnipotent. We human beings are none of these things, yet we are made in the image of God. So three things follow for this for Rabbi Sachs. One, we can improve the world, but we can't perfect it. Two, if God is all-knowing, then no human individual or group by definition can grasp the whole truth. The best we can do is to reason together in that common pursuit, which is what universities should be all about. As he put it, 3, if God is everywhere and has set his image on everyone, then God exists also outside the Abrahamic covenant as well as within it. That is the only form of theology that can yield the God-given integrity of otherness, the dignity of the stranger. The alternatives are tribalism, many nations, many gods, or universalism, one God, one faith, and only one gate to salvation. Now, that means that the rabbinical nature of Rabbi Sachs, his deep belief in the one God, is foundational for all the other key messages that he has to tell us in the social and political realm that we will hear about and we have already heard about. But I'm not going to talk about the content much today. What I want to do is talk about leadership and being a public intellectual. So, Robert Tucker has a model of political leadership, which talks about three elements. You've got to diagnose the problem, you've got to have a remedy, a policy remedy, and then you've got to mobilise support necessary for implementation. Now, public intellectuals are not politicians, so they don't actually have to implement anything. But they still have to mobilise the support. So the diagnosis and the policy remedy has been dealt with in great, in such a good way that I'm cutting out that part of my speech, which quoted the very same things as Rabbi quoted. So I'm going to pass over on that and go straight to the mobilisation. Okay. So a public intellectual has to inspire, influence, and direct people. And it has to do that primarily with language. And when I think of Rabbi Satz's impact, Professor Eli Gottlieb's here, and I remember we were at the Van Der Institute once, and it was a full audience, and it was like a whirlwind listening to Rabbi Sacks. And it reminds me of Winston Churchill as portrayed in the film The Darkest Hour, in his most important speech on the 4th of June, 1940, where the fate of the world hung on one person. And it's the famous speech, "We shall fight on the beaches." And in the film, the Foreign Secretary who wished to make a compromise peace with Hitler, Lord Halifax, is sitting in the gallery, because he can't sit in the House of Commons being a lord, and he is asked by his associate after Churchill's speech, what just happened? And Lord Halifax said, "Winston just mobilised the English language and sent it into battle." And that is Rabbi Sacks. What do you need to do that? Well, first of all, you have to be a credible messenger. You have to have integrity. So, as Arthur Daly might say, is it kosher, right? Are you really a rabbi? Can you represent the Jewish religious tradition? And are you really committed to freedom, individual rights, a free society? And one thing that you'll see from Rabbi Sacks, and he speaks about it sometimes, and he speaks about it often in relation to his father, and that is to be unapologetic about your particular identity in mainstream society. And on the other hand, when you're sitting with a Jewish audience, a religious Jewish audience, to be unapologetic about the values, the universal values that you believe in. I was once talking to him and asked for his assistance in dealing with boycott, divestments and sanctions against Bar-Ilan in 2005, and I asked him to say something in a particular way, and he said, "I can't do that, it's not my language." And he was right. It was my language as a political science professor from Bar-Ilan, but it wasn't his as chief rabbi. And knowing to be true to your own language means that you retain your credibility and your integrity, and people will not only hear you, they will listen to you. The second thing that you have to do is you have to be clear, resonant, and memorable. You have to be able to nutshell, in a small phrase, the essence of a message that is important. And that's what Churchill did with "We shall fight them on the beaches." And to do that, your reference points have to be ones that are familiar. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik and Rav Kook were great rabbis, but they were not public intellectuals. They are hard to understand. They are not easy to understand. What Rabbi Sacks tried to do is particularly difficult if you have a complex message. Because if you have a simple message, it's very easy to be clear. But what happens if you have a complex message, and your message is not only complex, but you want to retain the sense of complexity as being important to the message? You want to be simple without being simplistic. You want to say something political without being political. You want to be passionate without being angry. So if we look at Rabbi Sacks, he is constantly trying to keep a dialectic going, to maintain a conversation between universalism and particularism, the individual and the community, science and religion, tradition and modernity. He doesn't want us to reject any of them. But how do you do that? Well, what you do is you knock out the extremes in the debate. Here's one quote. The far right dreams of a golden age that never was. The far left dreams of a utopia that never will be. In such a nutshell statement, he has changed the framing of how we talk about politics. The one that our president likes most, and I have here, so I'm not going to repeat it, is about science and religion. And when the president was sitting with us and the Sacks legacy representatives, he told us that the president of Tel Aviv, I think it was university, or other scientists were saying, how can you do religion and science together? He said that quote, that's it. Right? To be able to encapsulate these things run on different tracks in such a way as to not have to say anything else is genius. And it's not only the message, it's that it's a compass. It allows you to navigate unknown waters. You haven't just got one page of a manual about how to do something and then you need the next page. No, you have a compass that can help you go forward. What else? The other thing that he does is he deconstructs words which have double meaning to replace what he would say, and I would say, is a mistaken meaning with a different meaning. So, he says, people will be, by historic standards, financially rich, but emotionally poor. In such a statement, he has changed the meaning, the value associated with rich and poor. My favourite is one that hasn't been said publicly, so I won't say who it was about, but he did say, how can it be that people who know so much understand so little? I know a lot of those people. The other thing he does is, if you can't be angry, how do you cope with extremism? Well, you cope with it through humour. You've never met a fundamentalist, religious or secular, who uses humour because they can't respond to it. If they respond forcefully, they look stupid. And if they don't respond, they look stupid. And if you look up Rabbi Sacks' Purim video with Ashley Blake, you'll see an example of a religious leader who is serious but doesn't mind not being taken seriously as himself. And that only enhances the power of the message, because what it actually radiates is confidence. I don't need to be perfect. I'm confident in my message. You can poke a little bit of fun at me. It's fine. The final element, and perhaps the most profound, is that if you want influence, you can't have power. You can't take sides in political parties. You can't take sides with political figures, because that's the arena that is tribal and competitive. It's legitimate, it's necessary, but it's not a place for a rabbi. The only exception to that is when a politician or a political party steps outside the accepted basis of the values that Rabbi Sachs represents. If it's a case of interpretation or implementation, I don't get involved. If it's Jeremy Corbyn being anti-Semitic, I call it out because it's an issue of values, primarily. That is why Rabbi Sachs had influence with leaders of different political parties. Tony Blair, John Major, and even politicians of the same party he didn't get on particularly well. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. I think he must be the only person, never mind religious leader, to be cited both by Vice President Mike Pence of the Republican Party and Joe Biden of the Democratic Party. Yair Lapid called him my rabbi. What's Bennett's first name? Naftali, sorry. Naftali Bennett, on receiving a book from the Legacy Trust by Rabbi Sachs, complained that he'd already read it. So that really is something impressive. To be written and quoted in Haaretz and Yisrael Hayom, to win awards at the Brookings Institute, which is centre-left, and the American Enterprise Institute, which is centre-right, to speak at Berkeley and Chicago is unique. So what does Rabbi Sachs have to say today about Israel and about where we are? A rabbi who doesn't want to take sides, a rabbi who doesn't want to be associated with political parties, but a rabbi who always felt the need to speak out about values. And the great thing is that I'm able to quote him out of context. So it's not about now. It's not a direct comment on a particular politician or a particular party. I'm able to go back to 2009 and make a general statement by Rabbi Sachs about the religious meaning of Israel. Here goes. Judaism must be depoliticized and put back where it belongs in civil society, far removed from all the structures of power. That is the challenge of Judaism in the state of Israel in our time. Its place is not in party politics, not as an arm of the state, not as a segregated enclave, not as an adversary culture, and not as a territorial ideology. Its role is to create, shape, drive, and motivate civil society. If religion is not seen by Israelis as a unifying force in society, if religious Jews are not admired for their work with the poor, the lonely, the vulnerable, if Judaism is not the voice of justice and compassion, then something is wrong in the soul of Israel. Equally, it is here, at the level of civil society, that Israel must integrate its entire population, Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, as equal citizens, the stranger in your midst, giving non-Jews precisely the level of dignity and respect that Jews would wish were the roles reversed. Do not oppress the stranger because you know what it feels like to be a stranger. It is truly my honour to be appointed the academic director of the future Jonathan Sachs Institute here at Bar-Ilan. For Rabbi Sachs, despite being political in some comments, the main arena of his work was educational. And what we want to do at our institute is bring forward Rabbi Sachs's academic, intellectual legacy, his ideas, into academia on every level, from undergraduate to graduate research, to doctoral research, to international multidisciplinary seminars, to alumni who will go on to influence the nature and hopefully the quality of Israeli society as a Jewish and democratic state. Thank you very much.